Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this webinar from Traditional Arts Indiana. We're using Google Hangouts, and so you can either see this via YouTube or from our events page. And if you check out the post on the traditionalartsindiana.org webpage, you can find all of that there. This recording will be archived on YouTube, and you'll be able to access it all if you're not able to stay through the whole piece. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this webinar, our participants as well as our audience that's out there. It's on DIY exhibits, and basically we have Emily Palombella and Meghan Smith are going to be taking the lead on presenting this webinar. I'm John Kay. I'm the director of Traditional Arts Indiana, and I'm really excited to be back doing webinars. We haven't done one in several months, and so this is our first one back. Before we get started, I should thank our sponsors for this program. We did receive a grant from the Indiana Arts Commission to offer these types of workshops, and that's helped pay for the bandwidth and the student workers and everything that we have doing these programs. And they ultimately get their funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, so we want to thank them. Traditional Arts Indiana is a statewide folk arts program that's based here at Indiana University in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. And we serve the whole state, documenting, presenting, and archiving materials from traditional artists all over the state. Today's topic is DIY exhibits, and we see this as being perhaps something we'll do several installments of. And several months ago, I was approached by the main library here on campus, the Herman B. Wells Library here at Indiana University, and they said, we're starting this brand new thing. It's going to be called the Scholars Commons. They did this, amazing remodel of the library, gutted the ground floor, went in and rebuilt, and set it up for a beautiful digital humanities program. And then they went around looking for units that might be able to do exhibits there. They came to us, and we were able to reach out to them and actually, or they were able to reach out to us, and we were able to actually step in. Mostly because we were able to do it on a shoestring and with resources that we had at hand. And so it really got us thinking more about this idea of DIY exhibits. And I'm sure both Meghan and Emily will tell you a lot more about that. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Meghan Smith and Emily Palombella.
Thanks so much for the introduction, John. Emily and I are very excited to be here today and to take part in this first webinar on DIY exhibit creation. As John mentioned, this exhibit is housed at the entrance to the Scholars Commons area. Emily, would you like to tell us a little about it?
Sure. When we were first approached by the Wells Library to put on this exhibit, we started looking through our collection and thinking about what we would like our exhibit to be about. The exhibit we put on is titled Who's Your Handmade? A Survey of Indiana Craft. When thinking about the theme and the text, it was important to conceive of the space it was going to be in. So TAI does lots of great field work with musicians and storytellers and other tradition bearers, but because this is a library, no sound was allowed. So we decided to focus more on the material culture items we have in our collection and different craftsmen and artisans across the state. We also decided that it would be best to show a wide variety of the type of artists we work with, from instrument builders to weavers to hoop net makers as well. So that's kind of where we started in thinking about this exhibit and wanting to show a wide swath of the sort of craftsmen we work with.
So one of our first considerations when we were trying to decide what we wanted to look at was selecting from our collections at TAI what kinds of objects we wanted to work with. Emily, I think you had a little more focus on this area too. I'll pass it back to you.
All right. And thinking about what objects we'd like to choose, we sort of went by an artist to artist basis in thinking whether we'd like a single object that was very much indicative of the type of work they do, or if we wanted several objects that would show either variety within their work or sort of cement how important a certain theme or style was within their work. In the case of the artists you see on the screen here, this is the painter Gustav primary paintings, and with him we thought it was important to show not just one of his works but several, so that you got a better feel of his style and the prevalence of certain themes within his work.
Also, you can see his use of color is really vibrant, and so having more than one piece available really gives you a better taste of his work. Another consideration we had in selecting objects was not just the interest of the object itself, but how the object would show up visually in the display cases that we had at our disposal. You saw earlier a photograph of our exhibit space. We had two large bookcase style display cases. These could be very multi-purpose for showcasing special books within the library, physical artifacts. We also had 3 horizontal, and as you saw in our last slide here, we had a couple of cabinets for things like paintings, posters, items of that nature. So one consideration we had with our artists we wanted to feature is well illustrated with the work of Roy Speight, an Indiana drum maker. We have this beautiful drum within our collection that Roy has built. As you can see, it has a wooden body and has a natural hide head where the head has not been dehaired. So it's tactilely quite pleasing. It's very beautiful. It has great acoustics. But because of the depth of the case itself, there was no way we could display the drum in a way that would really highlight some of the best qualities of the drum and some of the items of most interest, which are the head itself. So a solution we had to this problem was to select another object from our collection that would allow us to feature Roy Speight, but would also be an item that would be visually appealing, attractive, and really draw our audience in. So we decided to use one of Roy Speight's tongue drums. This is a style of drum that is built from a wooden box where the tongues that you can see protruding are then played by a pair of mallets. Each of the tongues is tuned to a particular pitch, and it's a multi-tonal drum. It's very interesting audibly, but is visually quite striking as well. You can see a couple of examples in the photo on the left, and then see one in our display case on the right.
All right, so once we had the theme of our exhibit in mind and had begun choosing objects, it was important to get an idea of the physical space itself. So at the beginning of the semester, Wells was still in the process of finishing installing cases. So you can see in this picture here, these are the side of the exhibit hallway with the 2 larger bookcase style cases, and those do not have shelves installed yet. And then again, there's 2 ports on the wall for the video screens. And this is the other side of the hallway with, again, with no video screens yet installed, and these are the flatter cases that work well for paintings and posters, and the backs are not yet installed in those cases either. So we, although they weren't quite ready for us to come and install, it was important for us to have a visual in mind and be able to conceive of this space. So we went down to Wells, took pictures, took measurements, and with what we saw there in mind, we headed back to the office, and one of the techniques we used in conceiving of the space without actually having access to it and being able to plan without being in the physical space was to begin with sketches in which we sort of planned out in the various styles and sizes of case that would best fit there, and sketching out what we thought would look good juxtaposed next to what other objects, and this was sort of our first technique in thinking of case layout.
Yeah, as Emily mentioned, we were not able to access the space initially, and we actually had a limited amount of time in which to design our exhibit. So working with sketches like this was really helpful. These are a couple of sketches of some of our horizontal display cases. Also, another tactic that we used was, as Emily mentioned, we took detailed measurements of the height, width, and depth of our shelf spaces, of the cases themselves, so that we could really understand how our artifacts would work spatially. So one tactic we worked with was with the measurements of the shelves and the display cases. We brought those measurements back to the office. We moved a table, and on our floor here at TAI headquarters, we used painter's tape, and according to the measurements of the shelves, we laid out a space, created outlines of the shelves, and began to play with objects within those outlines accordingly. It was a good way for us to play with and see how objects would fit on the shelf. Of course, we did a lot of fine tuning once we were able to actually get access to the shelves themselves. But this was a great way to start conceptualizing how things might look.
And once the cases were finished and the building team down at Wells had put the finishing touches, we were able to go down to the space and begin playing with the objects in the cases as we had planned, and see how that either worked or didn't work based on what we thought. And we went over to the Mathers Museum to get some advice on how best to use props in the cases to highlight items in the best way that they could be viewed by audience at the space here. So in this specific case, you'll see two instruments by instrument builder Milano Passage. On the top shelf is a brooch, and underneath that we elected to put a small wooden block. Otherwise, the instrument, the neck of the instrument was angled downwards, and it was important to us to best visually present this in a way in which it would be held and in the way in which it was best viewed. So this was a prop that was lent to us by Matt Sieber over at the Mathers Museum that's here on campus. And down on the bottom shelf, you'll see another stringed instrument by the same maker, and this is a small prima, and this is on a prop that was built for us by director John Kay. And again, it was important to us to prop up the necks of the instruments so that they weren't angled downwards and they were at a vantage point from which they would be best viewed.
These props are also very useful in that they help to really stabilize the objects themselves. One of our concerns was that in a public space, and particularly in a transient space where students are walking through regularly, we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't have an incident like a student or someone accidentally bumping into a case and, well, toppling something inside. So behind the prima, we also installed a couple of blocks to help keep it upright. And we also used a piece of the same grip mat that is used under area rugs and things of that nature. A little bit of rubber mat placed underneath the prima really helped to give it grip and stabilize it onto the prop itself.
And using wooden props and blocks to hold things up. We also consulted with the Mathers Museum on the best way to hang textiles and that they were both visually appealing as well as safe in protecting the item and not damaging it in any way. So we got advice from the curator over there, Ellen Siebert, and she had recommended that the best way to hang textiles was to create a muslin sleeve and with a long running stitch, sew that to the back of the textile, and through that sleeve slide a length of wood, which could then be nailed into the back of the case we were using here. So that's the technique we used for the rag rug that you see in this case, which was made by Dean Ehrman. And in the top of the case, you'll see a weaving made by Sung Men. And for this, we used a slightly different technique. I took a needle and thread and sewed a series of loops all across the top of the weaving. And then we nailed, again, a series of nails into the back, and we're able to hang each loop across that. And when using this technique, it's important to make sure that you are not sewing maybe one or two loops, but a vast series of them across the length of the weaving, because this will ensure that the weight is evenly distributed, so you don't have the entire weight of the weaving pulling at one or two spots, so that when you do take your exhibit down, your pieces have been preserved and they've been kept safe.
Emily Palombella is an excellent hand sewer, and so she was the one who created the loops and hand sewed the muslin sleeve onto the back of the rag rug. And this technique of hand sewing the muslin sleeve onto the back of the rag rug, for example, is really wonderful because with loose hand stitches, they can easily be removed after the exhibit. They're attached into the warp threads of the rug. And they can easily be pulled out without any damage to the artifact itself. So this was a great technique to learn from the Mathers. Another consideration we had simple additional materials in stabilizing our wooden props, for example, to make sure that our wooden blocks propping things like instruments and other artifacts wouldn't be sliding around. So we consulted with our local art supply store, small business here in Bloomington called Pygmalions, and through talking to them, we were able to get some recommendations for a kind of museum putty that would stabilize our blocks. We were also able to use these this kind of museum putty to mount some of our labeling signage that we had throughout the exhibit. It was quite useful. Another consideration we had too was we used the kind of picture hanger pictured here on the right for hanging our paintings from Gustav Potthoff. The wall we were able to nail our pictures into at the exhibit was quite shallow, so using these specialized hangers to drive a nail into the wall at an angle and add additional strength was really helpful to have on hand.
All right, and when designing your exhibit, another thing to be thinking about is how lighting is going to affect how people perceive the objects in the cases. You'll see with the two sort of tall bookshelf style cases that are on both the left and the right hand side of your screen, the way in which they're designed creates a fairly large shadow, especially on the top shelf. So with the case on the right hand side, we elected to drop down the top shelf a couple of pegs so that the washboard that's on the top shelf there, made by Bill Bailey, is visible just below the line of the shadow. And with the case on the left, we ended up not having to drop the shelf because the height of the dulcimer there is slightly shorter than the washboard, so that wasn't necessary. But it is important to be thinking about how shadows are being cast over your objects and how that affects how people will see them, especially when you're thinking about the variety of demographics who might be coming to your exhibit. this is a university, so largely adults pass through this area, but it is not outside of the realm of possibility that a child could be in this space. And in thinking about all sorts of vantage points on objects and different ages who might come to see your exhibit, it's important to think of what's going to be available at what site level. And with the picture in the middle, you can see some of our centrally located cases that were shallow and more horizontally oriented. And these were the only 3 cases that had lights installed in them. And when we installed objects, we were sure to sort of fiddle around with the lighting so that the objects were cast in their best light. And with this photo, you can see with the light on full blast, there's a very large shadow that's cast in this right-hand corner where the majority of our objects were in this case. So these are all things to think about when installing objects, is how light and shadow affects how viewers see things.
Also, the photographs you see here were taken with each of these 3 display cases open, but we should keep in mind and remind our viewers that these display cases actually featured a glass panel on the front. So issues of reflection also came into play, really in trying to place objects in such a way that the lighting within the Scholars Commons exhibit area would not be blocking the view of the object. So that was something we really played around with and took into consideration when creating our space as well. So another consideration we had in the creation of our exhibit was Emily and I were responsible for the installation of the objects themselves and curating the exhibit. But we also wanted to feature professional signage. We worked with graphic designer Kelly Totten and our program director, John Kay, here at TAI also helped us with videography, and we featured some documentary footage in our exhibit as well. So first of all, one consideration that we had was we had approximately 1 month from when we found out we would be installing this exhibit, perhaps a little more. 4 to 5 weeks was the amount of time we had to see the space, think about the installing, and finalize the installation of the exhibit by October 1st of this year. So we knew we wanted to coordinate externally with a graphic designer. And so our first important consideration was making sure that we had a concept for our exhibit early enough that we could give people like our graphic designer, Kelly Totten, give her plenty of time and materials to work with so that she could work on her end, play with different ideas for different kinds of banners. She created the banners you see here. On the right, we had one that features the title of the exhibit, Hoosier Handmade, a survey of Indiana crafts. And then we also wanted to create a banner describing Traditional Arts Indiana and the kind of work that we do. And we really like, actually, that the banner on the left is not specific to Hoosier Handmade, and thus it's something that we can use in other venues after the exhibit is over. But with timing in mind, we quickly realized that it was very important to realize how much time we had to work with, create a calendar, be very open in communicating with all members of the project, and set deadlines accordingly. So once again, Kelly was great to work with. She's worked for Traditional Arts Indiana before, and so she has a great understanding of our aesthetic at TAI, of our goals for the organization. So this was great to have featured.
And another part of signage that we tackled in our exhibit here is labeling and signage of the specific objects themselves. So again, we turned to the Mathers Museum for a little bit of advice. And we took a look at the way they labeled their objects there. And the way they do that is labeling each in a letter and then having a more centrally located sign, which gives a further explanation of what each object is, date, information about the place it's from, etc. So that was a technique that we decided to use because of the nature in which the cases were designed. We thought that using this technique would be the best way for people to access and actually be able to read this information. And for anyone thinking of doing your own exhibit, go to museums in your area, look at the way they do their signage for advice and ideas on how you might best format your signs.
So here you can see an example of how we implemented this idea. As Emily mentioned, we placed a letter next to each of our objects, and then we had a few corresponding signs that featured a list of letters, kind of in groups just based on where they were placed within the exhibit. And this was a really nice way to label each of our objects without having any kind of clutter in our labeling. We were a little concerned initially about space considerations in having a complete label describing the objects, the artists, and their city and county. Room for the objects to really shine, but label them sufficiently as well.
And in creating this exhibit, not only did we want to feature some of the objects that we have collected, but we also wanted to feature in a way the fieldwork we do and sort of be able to highlight the people behind those objects. So in our exhibit, there were a number of video screens, and on those screens we featured short bios of artists along with photographs, portraits, and also more detailed action shots. And we think that's a good way to both get a sense of the person, and also process is very important to us here at TAI. And I think it's also for people who might not be familiar with certain objects, it's also nice to see that object in action, see how it might be held or handled, or how it might be made depending on the case. And with this specific set of photos you see here, we have our washboard builder, Bill Bailey. On the left-hand side is a nice portrait of him, but then on the right you also get an action shot that shows him singing and playing one of the instruments he's made. And these two photos, out of all the photos we have in our archives here, we sort of like these two together specifically because in thinking about color and the way they will play off one another and be juxtaposed next to one another, we have complementary colors here with red in the barn in the background on the left-hand side, and then the highly dominant green colors in the background on the right-hand side. And thinking about how these will visually look on a slide, I think it's important to think about how the background looks and how colors might complement one another.
Another example of how we were thinking about photographs of our artists. This is once again another pair of photographs that we used. Here at Indiana University, we're lucky to have local folklorist Henry Glassy, who has mentored a lot of students here within IU's program of folklore and ethnomusicology. And the feature that Henry Glassy talks about extensively in terms of field work is always trying to get two kinds of photographs of any craftsperson or artist. One photograph in which they are featured working in their process actively, but also then featuring a photograph that's a portrait where they are deliberately looking at the camera. And Henry Glassy has noted it's especially nice to feature them with one of the objects that they are most proud of in their collection. And by doing so, it really says a lot about them. One thing as well about this pair of photographs is that it's always useful within a folklore agency or within a public arts agency when conducting any kind of field work, even if it's just aimed for an archive or if it's aimed for a particular project, it's nice to think also about potential future uses of the photographs when conducting field work and really trying to aim for a breadth of photographs, thinking about how they could be applied in different kinds of formats. I think that perhaps when the field work was conducted with Bill Wiseman, for example, they had no idea perhaps that the Hoosier Handmade exhibit would ever take place and that we would be using these particular photos, but we really like them and liked featuring them in the exhibit here. So that's a nice consideration to have with field work as well.
And here's a last set of photos to better illustrate what photos you might consider choosing and what might best work in a sort of different context. So here we have our memory painter, Gustav Potthoff. And in thinking about photos that we wanted to choose that would be cycling through the video screens at the exhibit, we actually like both of these photos a lot. The photo in the upper left-hand corner is a great visual document of what his space looks like, how he is oriented in that space, but in thinking about how it registers on a screen for people who might be standing in front of it and only looking at it for a few seconds, it's a little cluttered and you don't get as close up of a sense of him as a person. So it's good as a document of space, but not necessarily the best portrait for our uses at least. And then in contrast to that, we have the photograph that you see in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is an excellent portrait that shows him as a person, but then also highlights him in the context of his work. Both of these are good, just perhaps for different purposes and different uses.
All right, here you can see, once again, you can see the tall bookcase displays as well as our lit waist-high horizontal cabinets that we've talked about. And you can also see on this wall 2 of our display screens. On the left, you can see, this was a still from documentary footage that director John Kay made for us. It featured a of artists giving live demonstrations. Here, limestone carver Casey Winningham is giving a demonstration of how limestone is engraved with text. And on the right-hand side, you can see how some of our photos that we worked with were placed into the context of our slideshow. Once again, our slideshow was created by graphic designer Kelly Totten. We did our best to select a series of photographs we thought could be useful within our slideshow, provide those to her and let her make final decisions in terms of aesthetics, of what might work best within the slideshow. So as you can see, if you remember our banners from earlier and kind of the wood grain motif and the green and gray color scheme, we have the same colors featured in our slideshow as well. It helps give a sense of unity to the exhibit as a whole. And then you can see how the photos have been placed alongside the biography. In this case, for toy maker Melvin Stoll, we did not feature a portrait photograph since Melvin Stoll is a member of the Amish community and has chosen not to have his portrait photographed. But we found alternative ways of highlighting his work, showing a child playing with some of the toys that he makes, showing some of the children's furniture that he makes, or showing the hands of the maker pulling the trigger on this toy wooden gun, for example.
So once your exhibit has been installed, it's important to conceive of ways in which you will be publicizing it and ways in which people can become aware of the work you've done. And in our specific case, the nature of the space is such that mostly students are the only ones who'd be passing through. So for us, there's a very narrow audience who might be aware of this space and what's going on there. So for us, it was important to reach out to a broader audience and let people who maybe are not within the university context, let them know what we've been doing and invite them and give them information about if they'd like to come see our exhibit. So we like to use both Twitter and Facebook for shorter information and notices to people who follow us on social media. And then we also use our TAI blog to give further and more elaborate information. So all of these different platforms can sort of be used for different purposes, and it's important to use them in conjunction, so you get a variety of people who might use one platform but not use another. And it's the best way to include as many people as possible and make as many people as possible aware of your work and publicize your exhibit.
Not only did we want to inform some of our fans of TAI that we were putting an exhibit on at IU Bloomington's campus, but we wanted to take to share a little bit about our organization with students, faculty, staff members, and other visitors who might be passing through the Scholars Commons space at the Wells Library, and use our exhibit as a kind of springboard for educating people about our organization and the work we do. We know that we function within partnership with the Folklore and Ethnomusicology Department on IU Bloomington's campus. We also work with the Indiana Arts Commission, but there are a lot of parts of Indiana University who are not familiar with the kind of work we do. So by setting up a table at one side of the exhibit with our 2014 and 2013 annual magazines, this was a way that if we had students or others passing through the exhibit, stopping to look at objects within the exhibit, or stopping to look at documentary footage, or read some of the slides in our slideshow, that if the exhibit overall really piqued people's interest, this was a way that they could further engage and learn more about the kind of work that we do. We, for example, saw that our documentary footage really drew in a lot of outside viewers. It was attractive, it was very visually attractive, caught people's attention. People were really fascinated to stop and watch how limestone was engraved, or how a bowl was hewn, or how a basket might be woven. So this was a great method for inviting people to learn more. We wanted to feature our most recent magazine from 2014, but we also found it quite pertinent to set copies of our 2013 magazine out as well, since we had a couple of pieces in our exhibits and footage within our documentary loop featuring work with limestone. We really wanted to feature our 2013 magazine, which focuses heavily on limestone traditions within Indiana. So this was a consideration we had as well, was really trying to provide more resources about our organization to visitors within the exhibit. Another way to do this could simply be to post a website for an organization, a simple handout designed at the time of the exhibit, anything like this to really welcome viewers to further engage and learn more. So these are some of our initial thoughts that we have on our experience creating an exhibit for the Scholars Commons space at the Wells Library. And this was really a special opportunity. Emily and I, while we have both been interested in museum studies, we had never actually engaged with creating an exhibit before, and we learned quite a bit through the process, and it was quite a special opportunity to be involved with. So at this time, we'd like to open up discussion for any questions from our viewers. And we will stand by for a minute if anyone has anything they would like to comment on or ask.
I want to thank Meghan and Emily for doing a great job with this. They've really done a good job with it, and they've brought up a lot of wonderful ideas. There were just a few questions that were asked in the question and answer side of the webinar. One of them was, what software did we use to create the slideshow? That could have been made in almost anything, from a really decent Word document or PowerPoint. We used InDesign to design the pieces, and then we pasted that the JPEGs or the image files into PowerPoint for the looping PowerPoint slide. The other question was asked, how long did we have before we to kind of get things started and get it installed? We knew that we were going to do it probably a good month ahead of time, but then they kept pushing off the time that we could actually get in there, and we ended up having to change people that were going to do the exhibit. And finally, what did it end up being, Meghan, when we actually got to get in there and install the exhibit?
Well, Emily and I knew that we would be doing the exhibit about a month ahead of time, but it was really only within the last week or so that we were able to physically access the space and start placing objects. So we really had a short amount of time to engage with the exhibit space before it was accessible and we could install items. So this is where our layout techniques that we talked about of taking measurements of cases, kind of mapping out the space on the floor so that we had kind of a trial area to play with objects. This is where these techniques really came in handy and were quite useful to us, so that even though we weren't able to physically place the objects yet, we had other ways of engaging with the space and thinking about it and talking it through.
I think that's probably all the questions that we have. We ran pretty much the 45 minutes that we thought that we would be here. I'd like to thank again everyone for joining us. We had quite a few people in the webinar hangout. We're going to check one last time to see if there are any more questions. We have any more questions over there? Emily? Okay, the issue of maintenance with the exhibit and that type of thing, because this was intended to be a digital humanities project, the touch screens created some issues early on, and it's been a learning process with them. We had intended to have a touch screen technology that we had designed to install, and all of this other work was going to be based around that. Unfortunately, the touch screen didn't happen. And we ended up just looping our video and our slideshow on that. But yeah, I think having the looping material works well. I think the Wells is learning about how much work's going to go into some of the other technology. But I think even a small library or museum could do well with trying to do exhibits on rotating TV kiosks. Any other questions? I think that's it. I'm going to turn it back over to Meghan Smith to kind of say goodbye for us here.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to work on the exhibit and to have a chance to reflect on it today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and this is Emily as well. I just want to thank everyone for listening. And we hope you enjoyed and maybe learned something that if you're going to put on an exhibit for yourself or do some public programming, that you've hopefully learned a few tips or ideas for how to do that yourself. So thank you for listening.
If you have any further questions about the exhibit, feel free to contact us through our website or through Facebook or Twitter as well. We would welcome the chance to talk to you more. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.